I have a prop. I'm really excited. It's not officially out yet, so like the fact that I have a few of these little books in my hand is like, my little baby I'm holding on to here. So let me see, where did my slide advancer go here? Okay. So thank you, Martha, for that kind introduction. Thank you to Hope and to Gina Virgil and Liz Manigan and Liz Davis and all the other people who helped organize today's fantastic event. I feel extraordinarily fortunate to be giving this talk here today. This book was nurtured by Fordham, by my life as a Fordham faculty member, by the research support that I received from the institution, by the leaves they granted me to do this work, and by my colleagues and by my wonderful students in my U.S. Women's History class. And it's my first talk on this book. So I'm thrilled that I get to do it here with all of you. Martha gave me a perfect opening. I start back before the story that she told us about the fate of pregnant workers today. It was 1966, just 2 years after the landmark Civil Rights Act made it illegal for the first time ever to discriminate against women in the workplace. And Ida Phillips, a mother of 7, applied for an assembly line position at Martin Marietta in Orlando, Florida. Phillips had been waitressing, but the hours were unpredictable, and the wages were terrible, and she was looking for a better, regular job. Martin Marietta turned her down flat. They cited their policy that they would not hire women with preschool-aged children and refused to even consider her application. Phillips fired off an outraged letter to President Johnson that night, and with the support of both civil rights and feminist lawyers, she took her case all the way to the Supreme Court. "It's not just for myself that I'm doing this," Phillips would later observe, "it's for all mothers." Although more and more mothers, like Phillips, have been going to work in the 2 decades after World War II, underlying beliefs about their primary obligation to family had not changed. It was not only legal to deny mothers, like Phillips, jobs, to deny pregnant workers a job, but also to keep a woman from going back to work after giving birth, even if she wanted to. Pregnancy and childbirth were routinely and wholly legally excluded from employer health insurance plans. When Phillips' case was heard before the Supreme Court, her cause seemed so outlandish that the justices and Martin Marietta's lawyers bantered back and forth about the horrifying potential outcomes of giving her a job. Female porteresses on trains, female ditch diggers, male stewards on airplanes. Now, one Martin Marietta lawyer was so horrified at that thought that they thought the airlines would simply go out of business if there weren't female stewardesses to attract male businessmen onto the airlines. Chief Justice Warren Burger worried out loud that he would have to hire a lady law clerk. And oh no, she'd have to go home at 6 p.m. to cook dinner for her husband. Phillips won her case in January 1971. Much to the surprise after that testimony. Yet, in 1973, feminist lawyers still had a 75-page brief that listed unfair workplace policies directed at pregnant women. My favorite one of these was the right to use your paid vacation days as a worker to take a vacation on the beaches of Bermuda, but not to give birth. I won't get into the details, and they're fascinating, but let me just tell you that feminist lawyers across the country, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who led many of the most important cases, filed suit after suit. And after the Supreme Court ruled decisively against them in December 1976, outraged feminists led partly by Ginsburg, founded a coalition to fight for legislation ending discrimination against pregnant workers. The coalition eventually had over 200 organizations as members, and feminists successfully spearheaded the passage of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act just 20 months later in October 1978. And in fact, in a week, on October 31st, we will witness the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. Philip's case and the campaign for the Pregnancy Discrimination Act illustrate the power of women's collective action to bring about change. Phillips turned to social movements to support her fight. First civil rights, then women's rights. It was those networks that turned an individual's case into a cause for all American women. And it was the data gathering of feminist lawyers, fueled by a healthy dose of shared outrage and frustration, that generated the 75-page brief so critical to backing up advocates' testimony to Congress and rallying broad public support for the legislation. I want to talk today about the power of such collective action by American feminists of the 1960s and 1970s on behalf of issues that we now call work and family. By work and family, I mean the umbrella of issues that start in the home and end in the workplace that still create barriers to women's equality. They encompass equitable sharing of household labor, fair treatment of those who work in homes caring for the children, the disabled, and elderly, and adequate opportunity to care for newborns and infants without losing a job or being impoverished. But they also involve accessible and affordable childcare, flexible scheduling that benefits women and children, and fighting the still unequal burden of family care, blocking gender equity in pay. I'm drawing on my new book, Feminism's Forgotten Fight, The Unfinished Struggle for Work and Family, to provide us with some stories, some examples, some highs and lows in the fight for women's equality that feminists led 4 decades ago. My aim is to reflect on what feminists achieved, to tell perhaps a new story of the movement, what stalled out their ambitious vision, why we haven't achieved it, and what we in this room might take away for our own lives about shared commitments to fight for equality and social justice, and about ways to give back to our communities and society. I begin inside the home, where feminists put forward an array of creative proposals to give value and recognition to housework. On February 11th, 1975, activists gathered at the Hudson Guild Fulton Center to learn about the campaign for wages for housework. Imported from Europe in the late 1960s, wages for housework committees formed across the US and demanded wages for homemakers to be provided by the government. By their reasoning, unpaid housework added value to the economy while leaving women dependent and vulnerable. Paying wages to homemakers was a fair way to compensate them for their labor and to force society to see the contributions housewives made. The Hudson Guild Fulton Center meeting was part of an educational campaign that the New York Wages for Housework Committee launched in early 1975. And you can see their sort of brilliantly graphic illustration of the impact of women's household labor in this flyer for that meeting. Wages for Housework advocates in this educational campaign explored the range of ways that the lack of pay for household labor left women vulnerable. They were vulnerable to substandard housing because they had no money to pay for rent. They were vulnerable to exploitation at the second jobs they had to take to make ends meet. And they were vulnerable to impoverishment in old age because housewives built up no Social Security benefits in their own right. Now, wages for housework activists were radicals, and the movement itself did not result in a new system of wages for housework. Their proposals, however, had broad appeal in the period, and feminists of all stripes picked up on their analysis of how unequal responsibility for unpaid housework contributed to women's inequality. There was added urgency to the fears about women's economic vulnerability as homemakers in the 1970s, as more and more women, particularly middle-aged women, faced life on their own with rising divorce rates. And more of them were forced out of the home with little economic resources and into the labor force by the weak economy. So feminists were acutely aware that housewives were a prime target for thinking about the problem of equality. And indeed, they thought in a variety of enormously creative and occasionally comical ways. One of feminists' favorite in-jokes about housewives' precarious situation was captured in this sardonic Doonesbury cartoon. Doonesbury's kind of alternate lifestylist, Nicole, reports on the latest hot tip for women at home, trade-a-maid. In this scheme, housewives A and B, they're best friends, they cross the street, they clean each other's homes, they get paid wages by each other's husbands, they deposit Social Security in their own names because of getting paid wages by each other's husbands. They get some money, they contribute to family income, their husbands learn the value of housework. Why, that's the most amazing system I've ever heard of, Nicole, sputters DJ Mark. It's illegal, though, right? Not yet, Nicole replies. Now, trade-a-maid schemes took more serious form in legislative and legal change. At the state level, feminist lawyers and legislators worked to enshrine recognition of housewives' contribution to marital property in divorce law, while at the national level, feminist legislators like New York's Bella Abzug and California's Yvonne Brathwaite Burke sponsored a host of legislation to expand divorced women's access to Social Security and support middle-aged divorced women through job training programs. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about the whole kind of array of all these things that they accomplished, but I'm trying to give you the biggest picture I can in a short amount of time. Among feminist legislative successes on behalf of the problem of housework was an April 1974 law that required payment of the minimum wage to domestic workers. Household workers were among the lowest paid and least protected American workers. They had been deliberately excluded from the package of worker rights that were first enacted during the Depression of the 1930s. So domestic workers worked in a kind of netherworld of employment with many of the worker protections that we take for granted now not extended to them. In the mid-1960s, domestic workers began to organize to fight for better treatment, for what they called the 3 Ps: pay, protection, and professionalism. In 1971, Edith Barksdale Sloan took over the leadership of the new national organization, the Household Technicians of America. HTA had 37 affiliates and 25,000 members at its peak in 1974. That was on a par, by the way, of the largest national women's organizations in this period, just to give you a sense of the scale of organizing that was done by leaders like Edith Barksdale Sloan, who was a graduate of Hunter College and a former official with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. But the foot soldiers of the movement were everyday, ordinary, domestic and household workers, women who were largely African American. HTA forged an alliance that was sometimes fraught, but nevertheless sturdy, with mainstream feminist organizations like the National Organization for Women. Major feminist leaders signed onto the cause. Eleanor Holmes Norton, the African-American New York City Human Rights Commissioner, Dorothy Hayner, the labor activist and now founder, and Gloria Steinem, for example, all backed the group. What HTA shared with other feminist activists was the insight that society systematically undervalued women's household labor, and in doing so, perpetuated women's inequality. Feminists were painted at the time, and have been since, as unremittingly hostile to housewives and the home. This simply is not true. In their wide-ranging housework activism, feminists turned their energies to the private side of the challenge of work and family. They wanted men to share the housework, of course, too, and I could talk more about the wide array of activism in the Q&A that they did to get men involved in the home, and also about male feminists who joined them. But no, they didn't just want men to share in the housework. They also wanted unpaid homemaking to be a life possibility that did not penalize women or leave them economically vulnerable. In other words, they wanted it possible to be a homemaker without facing the prospect of destitution or lacking autonomy and independence and economic security. They also wanted to be sure that those who did this essential work for pay, like domestic workers, were respected and fairly compensated for it. So the home was one place where the second wave demanded changes in work and family, but so was society. In 1971, the United States almost had a system of national childcare. Childcare, universal, community-controlled, 24-hour childcare, was a rallying cry of the women's movement. The very first Women's March, the August 1970 Strike for Equality, made universal childcare one of its 3 fundamental demands. And to prove their point, women all across the country set up impromptu ad hoc daycare centers during the march. City Hall in New York received a batch of preschoolers while women deposited their toddlers on the desk of Mayor Lee Alexander in Syracuse, New York. Poor mothers in the welfare rights movement demanded childcare. The Third World Women's Alliance observed that 24-hour childcare was necessary for women who worked at night. Socialists and radicals, who rarely agreed with the liberals, unanimously called for universal childcare at their 1969 Congress to unite women. Feminists of all these backgrounds envisioned childcare as a shared public service and good. So it's a very different conception of childcare than we think about it. We think about it now as like a practical necessity in order to be able to go to work and survive. But from the feminist perspective, it was supposed to be a basic public service. So as the National Organization for Women's founding statement of purpose declared, we demand that child care facilities be established by law on the same basis as parks, libraries, and public schools, adequate to the needs of children from the preschool years through adolescence, as a community resource to be used by all citizens from all income levels. And for a moment, it seemed that feminists might achieve that goal. A coalition of children's advocates, civil rights organizations, labor unions, and feminists came together at the end of the 1960s to fight for the Comprehensive Child Development Act, which would have created a federally funded system of child care centers. The bill passed in late 1971 with broad support from both parties in Congress. And then on December 9, 1971, President Nixon vetoed the legislation. Although the Nixon administration had backed the bill at first, the president issued the veto after letters poured in from parents denouncing the legislation as putting the government rather than the family in charge of childbearing. It was one of the earliest displays of the gathering pro-family conservative movement that would emerge in the 1970s to call into question and block feminists' goals. The veto was a huge blow for feminists, and historians have typically stopped there in their histories of the movement and said that feminist childcare activism was essentially dead in the water, limited to the few years around this legislation. But that national bird's eye view missed the extraordinary burst of grassroots childcare activism. All across the country, feminists came together to start childcare centers. A kind of do-it-yourself ethos sprang up. Church basements, YWCAs, old storefronts, college buildings, anywhere organizers could cajole sponsors to give them space, they started childcare centers. They published do-it-yourself manuals that told local groups everything from how to get licensed down to the ins and outs of a preschool curriculum. They even published templates for building tot-sized furniture. The Lollipop People that you see there was an educational and fundraising kit created by Now in the early 1970s, around 1972. It had 125 color slides. Remember how they used to come in those little reels and you would take them around? So it had 125 color slides that were distributed to users. Users were provided with scripts, and it was a kind of roadshow on behalf of childcare. They took the roadshow to schools and colleges, to hospitals, to business, and the public, all as part of this grassroots effort to build childcare centers, to start childcare centers. According to one national study, the number of daycare centers increased 30% between 1970 and 1976, in no small part due to feminist activism. Feminists knew that without childcare, women's equality was impossible. As the early Now President Karen DeCrow observed, no woman can be at home in the world when her total world is the home caring for her children. The feminist vision was not, however, for universal childcare to enable stretched lives of dropping off children, rushing to work, rushing to pick children up, and then hurrying home to exhausted rounds of dinner making, bath time, and a few loads of laundry in between. They hoped for a system where childcare became part of a broader system of supports for women so that they could be full and equal citizens. Yes, childcare was important to feminists so that women could take jobs, but also so that they could be involved in political work and in society and find time to develop as human beings. This was work and family activism as a kind of moral vision, where society shared some of the burdens of raising its citizens so women could have full and equal lives. Childcare activism was thus another piece of feminist comprehensive vision of change that went from the private sphere to the home, to the public sphere of government and social action, and on to changes in the workplace. Among the most important workplaces where feminists fought for change was the federal government. The federal government was the largest national employer. It had around 700,000 working in the federal civil service in the late 1960s. And as the feminist movement began to gain momentum, women working for the government looked around and saw the discrimination they were enduring day to day in their work, saw how they were being held back at the bottom of the civil service ladder. And in 1968, they formed the organization Federally Employed Women. It was originally called Too Few, federally employed women. And then it's still alive today. Federally employed women has chapters all across the country and outside the US even, where some federal workers are based. Their goal was to advance women in the civil services, and they were one of many such workplace caucuses to advance women's interests inside workplaces that feminists stimulated. So I use FEW, even though it's in the public sector, as an example of the kind of organizing that happened also in private sector workplaces across the country. The organization included all grades of civil service workers, from the secretaries, the office managers, and the admins, up to those in executive level positions, all inside one organization. The membership was about half African American, and its first president was a Black civil rights activist named Allie Latimer Whedon, who went on to lead the General Services GSA, the General Services Association. FEW supported training to advance women up the civil service ladder and monitored federal equal employment programs. But they also partnered with feminist legislators like Patricia Schroeder of Colorado to promote part-time and flexible scheduling legislation. And feminists were among the first to fight for part-time and flexible scheduling legislation and opportunities. It was a hard fight for feminists, in part because their traditional allies, the unions, opposed flexible scheduling. From the union perspective, the 40-hour work week was a hard-earned labor right, and they feared that flexible scheduling or part-time work could compel workers to work long hours without overtime pay and weaken their labor rights. It was also a hard fight for feminists because fighting for part-time work risked positioning women in the kinds of dead-end employment that they were fighting to get out of. Nevertheless, over the course of the 1970s, feminists increasingly led on the issue of flexible scheduling, arguing that it was essential for the true equality of enabling women to raise children and have the opportunities to have jobs, and that real meaningful legislation could be passed that secured career ladder opportunities with both part-time work and flexible scheduling. With the partnership of Schroeder, Bella Abzug of New York, and several other feminist legislators, they introduced bill after bill, and in 1978, in September 1978, Congress passed the first Flexible Scheduling Act for the federal government, making the federal government a model of flexible scheduling opportunities. It was initially a temporary law, and over time has become a permanent part of several civil service employment. So, what's the end result of all of this activism? It was a comprehensive vision of change in the work and family order. Feminists did not envision simply opening the door to the workplace, although we should not underestimate what an achievement that was. They didn't open the door and shove women in and say, you figure it out, right? They didn't envision making women into mini-men, into the same as 1950s male breadwinners. Rather, feminists fought for change at home, like valuing housework. They fought for change and action by society, as in supporting universal childcare, and they fought for changes in workplaces through real, flexible, and part-time work possibilities. From their perspective, full citizenship for women required not simply individual opportunity, but changes in society, institution, and culture. Now, clearly, what I've described is not a vision achieved. So why did change stall? First, opposition rallied. It grew stronger over the course of the 1970s as conservatives gained power and as a conservative pro-family movement fought feminist proposals. Perhaps the peak moment of conflict where this growing divide and the growing mobilization against feminist agenda became apparent was at a peak moment for the women's movement. This was the 1977 National Women's Conference in Houston, where tens of thousands of women came together to advance a plan of action for women to celebrate the achievements of the movement. But a counter-mobilization occurred in Houston where virtually equals of numbers of women and men rallied by the pro-family movement gathered to oppose feminist initiatives, claiming that they undermined the family, that they endangered children, and that they advanced an immoral, man-hating agenda. The pro-family movement forged an alliance with the emerging conservatives of the Ronald Reagan era and went on to help successfully stall out many of feminists' proposals. But I think that change stalled in addition because changes in laws were not the same as changes in culture. It's hard to make deep-seated shifts in identities and intimate relations, and it's hard to make changes in institutions. And what we've ended up with is something that I think of is more anodyne, and in some ways a term I'm seeking to try to get us to have a different conversation about. We lost the history of feminist activism for work and family when it became about the conversation we had became about the choices individual mothers make. As early as 1978, the feminist writer Letty Cotton Pogrebin was recognizing the limitations of that conversation as she dissected the emerging myth, as she called it, of having it all. The idea of having it all is that women can have it all. It's a wonderful thing, right? To have the kind of full lives that men had had of caring for children and having vital employment and satisfying, enriched lives. But having it all has increasingly morphed into an attack on feminism for failing to enable women to have the full choices that they were supposed to have. And the attack on feminism has been leveled even as early as the 1980s by feminist stalwarts like the leader Betty Friedan, who accused feminists of failing to pay attention to the problem of the family. That's simply not true. My work, and as I hope I've shown to you today, has uncovered this enormous array of activism on behalf of the family that feminists undertook in the 1960s and 1970s. And I think it's time to resurrect that history, and that's in part what motivated me to write this book. I think that in this history we can see a feminism for our own time. Because despite the Me Too movement, which I think is an absolutely critical movement, the top issues that women describe in survey after survey of their workplace concerns are wage inequity, which is linked, by the way, to their responsibilities for caring for children in homes, the problem of combining child rearing and breadwinning, and work-life balance. So we need to resurrect the comprehensive vision of the second wave that involved fatherhood, equitable housework and caring labor, including fair pay and working conditions for those doing that work as paid labor. We need decent supports for mothering, especially for those who are poor or single parents, so that not only middle class and wealthy women and men have adequate time to be with and raise their children. We need universal child care as a public good like libraries, parks, and public schools. We need real paid family leave We are one of 2 nations in the entire world that does not have paid maternity leave. Our companion in that status is Papua New Guinea. Flexible schedules and part-time work need to be made real jobs for both women and men with benefits and career ladder opportunities. So I know that this is an idealistic vision, right? But I sometimes I think it's important just to put it out there, to know that that vision was put forward before, to know that a whole movement of activists got behind it and made gains, and to know that despite defeats, they regrouped and rallied across the 1960s and 1970s. And I think it gives us some ideas about how to act and where to act today. So I close with a bit of a how-to manual, my takeaway from second wave feminist organizing. So what do we do? Where can we get involved? How can we make change today? First, it's important to get involved in associations, in groups. Feminists organized together in groups, collectively, like the giving circles that we're talking about today. Women coming together collectively to set goals and priorities and seek change. Internal organizations, I cannot underestimate the significance of workplace networks and associations, and I mean in that not just the old girls network, which is extremely important, but the kind of self-conscious organizing that brought women at all ranks, at all employment levels in an organization together to collectively understand how women were being stalled out, what kinds of barriers and obstacles they faced in their workplaces. It involves getting engaged with the halls of government, from becoming elected officials to working on government commissions. There are all kinds of commissions that local and state governments set up that many feminists in this period became involved in and were an effective way to scrounge up funding for key initiatives that they wanted to advance. Getting involved in the legal arena. There was a huge network of feminist lawyers that is still alive today. As always, taking to the streets. It never hurts.